The climate summit in Baku, the much-anticipated COP29, finally wrapped up last weekend.
Sub-items 11A, new collective quantified goal on climate finance.
But like many of these agreements, it seems to leave us with more questions than answers. Under the New Deal, from now until 2035, wealthy nations have agreed to contribute $300 billion a year to help developing countries adapt to and mitigate the impacts of climate change. Now, $300 billion. That sounds pretty impressive, right? But I want to put it into perspective. According to Reuters, $300 billion is the equivalent of just 45 days of global military spending, or 40 days of global crude oil consumption, or, to give you a more tangible example, is slightly more than the $250 billion the US spent this year on damages from Hurricane Helene. Or, it's less than Elon Musk's net worth, which sits around $320 billion. So when we look at that way, it's not really hard to understand why some developing countries left COP29 feeling frustrated and even angry.
We walk back home with 300 and we say that the developed countries are taking the lead. This is an insult to what the convention says. Should I remind us of what the convention says? That it noted that developed countries had the largest share of historical and current global emissions. This might be 1994, but it's still very current till now. It also said that the developed countries will take the lead, and this lead is climate finance. That the developing country is saying that it's taking the lead with $300 billion till 2035 is a joke. I think we should rethink it. It's not just by putting it in our statements, but we have a right as countries to choose if we're going to take this or not. And I'm saying that we do not accept this. You expect us to have ambitious NDCs. The NCQG was supposed to enable us to have realistic finance goals. $300 billion is unrealistic. Let us tell ourselves the truth. This is 3 a.m. and we're going to clap our hands and say this is what we're going to do? I don't think so.
This speaker is from Nigeria. This year, the country faced severe floods that displaced over 1 million people. And on top of that, Nigeria is grappling with one of its worst hunger crises. The UN's warned that next year, more than 30 million Nigerians will face food insecurity. For a country that relies heavily on agriculture for both food and economic growth, climate change is making it harder and harder to sustain its population. And the UN is quite clear about this. The deal also includes a broader pledge. By 2035, the UN aims to mobilize $1.3 trillion a year from both public and private sources to support developing countries. Is that enough? Well, according to a 2021 UN report, for developing countries to carry out their climate action plans, they need $6 trillion by the year 2030. So if $6 trillion is what's actually needed, then how much will this $1.3 trillion really accomplish? I'm Fei Fei, and this is Climate Watch, the podcast where we break down the big climate questions with insights from experts and industry insiders. My hope is to give you a better understanding of our planet and inspire you to take action, big or small. If you tuned in last week, I had a conversation with Professor Teng Fei from Tsinghua University. He explained a growing point of contention in climate finance. That is, some developed nations want large developing countries like China, India, and Saudi Arabia to contribute financially to these efforts as well. But here is the issue. Countries like China would argue the responsibility to pay lies with those who contributed the most to the crisis, which are the historically industrialized nations. The logic is simple and is also mentioned by that Nigerian speaker. Wealthy countries emitted the bulk of greenhouse gases during their industrialization. So now, they should take on the financial burden of helping poorer nations who are often on the front lines of climate impacts. And this fundamental disagreement continues to be one of the biggest roadblocks at climate negotiations like COP29. So to better understand the complexities of climate finance, I spoke with Liu Shuang. She's the China Finance Director at the World Resources Institute. I'm wondering, what do you feel about the outcomes at the COP29 in Baku this time?
Yeah, there are a lot that we can share on the process as well as the outcomes of Baku. I do think that at the end, we are glad to see there is an NCQG, which is the new climate finance goal, and there's a deal achieved out of Baku. Then developed countries have committed to provide and mobilize at least 300 billion every year by 2035 for developing countries and to support developing countries in climate mitigation and adaptation. Of course, we don't think that 300 billion US dollar every year is enough, but that's a first down payment ensuring that developing countries will be on the track to achieve their equitable and climate-friendly transition towards 2035 and beyond.
You don't think that this $300 billion is enough for all the climate actions that we want to take, especially in developing countries? And why do you say that?
I think there are two gaps we have seen in this commitment. One is the quantum target. We are looking at the asks of developing countries in Baku, as well as some of the analytical results from the world well-known experts on that to achieve the climate transition that's aligned with 1.5 degree target. Developing countries needs at least 1.3 trillion US dollar every year to achieve that transition. So in terms of the quantum target, 300 billion every year, it's really shy away from the 1.3 trillion that's very much needed for the transition. The other part that's kind of missing in the Baku deal is the quality of the climate finance. We've seen that many of the developing countries, because the constraints on the physical space and also that situation, many of the developing countries are asking for better quality of climate finance from developed countries, but we haven't seen a very promising commitment from developed countries on that out of Baku.
Can you specify on this? Like, why do you think it's not enough in terms of the quality of this finance?
Yeah, I think we have seen, for instance, many developing countries who are in the debt stress. They just simply do not have the physical space for them to accept the financing from developed countries to support the climate transition. And then the second point where we have seen is there are certain aspects of the climate action, and notably the adaptation work that's very much needed by many developing countries. They will need higher concessionality climate finance. That is to say, that's a climate finance with lower interest rate and longer repayment period with more generosity so that developing countries can access those types of climate finance to support the climate adaptation efforts so that they can make themselves more resilient of the climate impacts that they're very much suffering from these days.
Then, on the other hand, I think the developed countries would argue that they are also faced with a lot of financial difficulties, especially in recent years. And what do you think are the hurdles that are, I won't say stopping them from providing this money, but more of slowing their pace in fulfilling their financial commitments?
Yeah, I think there are many aspects that we need to look into under this question. Out of many options, how developed countries can better support developing country in climate mitigation adaptation. If I can name several of the examples, we have seen that in the past, the fulfillment of $100 billion every year from developed countries to developing countries, a large portion of what has been done was channeled through multilateral channels. That includes the multilateral development banks or MDBs, as well as multilateral climate funds. And a large portion of what's managed under MDBs is actually how MDB mobilize the private finance. The joint reports the MDB have published on climate finance in the past years shows before 2022, every single dollar MDB spent on climate finance was able to mobilize about 25 US dollar sets of climate finance from private financial resources. If MDB can do a lot more by providing guarantee and the other de-risking mechanisms, they don't have to increase the capital ask from donor countries or developed countries. With the existing capital MDBs can have, for instance, in 2023, every single dollar MDB spent on climate finance was able to mobilize more than 10 cents of US dollar on private finance. So there is a way of not going to ask developed countries to take a lot more bilateral or the climate finance responsibilities, just using and deploying the current financing tools they have. There is a way of mobilizing and channeling more financial resources to developing countries. And that's where we should maximize the potential of those existing financial mechanisms.
Back to this COP29 and the final outcomes, there is still a chance that the developed countries won't fulfill or delay their commitments, just like what they did in the previous ones. And how do you think developing countries should cope with this reality? Do they need also come up or customize their own financial plans?
Yeah, so first of all, I do think there's one action point beyond developing countries that we should look into to make sure that developed countries will be held accountable for the commitment of 300 billion every year. That is, we have to look at the transparency of the progress of the climate finance. I don't think that the Baku deal has tons of details. That's probably where we'll have to look into COP30 in Brazil on what a robust transparency and accountability piece should be part of the NCQG or the climate finance goal package. So we will need those transparency to be in place to make sure that we will be on the track of achieving $300 every year. The other thing we do want to point out is even if that we are very much emphasizing on the international finance or the finance from developed countries, developing country in Baku or under UNFCCC at COP, the experts' estimates shows that a half of what the climate finance needed by developing countries will be achieved by mobilizing domestic financial resources. That's what we have seen in many developing countries, particularly emerging economies. So even if that under UNFCCC and in Baku, we are talking about the legal responsibility of developed countries to support developing countries with financial resources, we shouldn't ignore or underinvest into the role of the domestic financial resources that developing countries can mobilize for themselves. On top of that, there's also the South-South collaboration where China and the other emerging economies can play a more proactive role in providing the financial resources needed by developing countries.
That I'm also very interested in this part is that also in this COP, a lot of the developed countries has called on emerging developing countries, notably China, India, Saudi Arabia, to also become one of the donor countries. And of course, this call was met with objections from these countries. So I'm really curious about your take on this divergence between developed and big developing countries.
Yeah, if I can use a quote of some delegation from the developed countries in the plenary, is at this COP, and I think that's probably the case with many other COPs, is we're trying to find quote unquote common ground with genuine difference. I do think that we're seeing, at least from the results of the Baku deal, we're seeing more convergence in divergence on climate finance deal. So we're seeing the core target of the climate finance goal, that's the $300 billion every year. It's largely about developed countries to developing countries. But there's another layer which is recognized of South-South cooperation on voluntary basis, the climate finance that can be provided, mobilized by developing countries to developing countries. And this is where we have also seen during the first week of COP, China's vice premier have announced for the first time a larger scope of the climate finance that China has, quote unquote, provided and mobilized for other developing countries. So that sends a very positive signal. And I do think that in different occasions, we have here that very clearly China says it will continue the support to other developing countries under South-South collaboration on a voluntary basis. So I do think to recognize the role of those South-South cooperation and voluntary basis, the financial mobilization is a key element of the overall climate finance needs and package that the developing countries need very much in the near future to support their climate action.
You also done a report looking at China's financing to other developing countries in this South and South cooperation. And why do you think cooperation like this is important in mitigating climate change or adapting climate change?
Yes, our report looked into between 2013 and 2022, what China has provided and mobilized in terms of climate-related finance for other developing countries. And our results shows, on average, China has provided mobilized about $4.5 billion every year for other developing countries. But this shows the financial perspectives of South-South collaboration. We do recognize there are non-finance perspectives. For instance, China is the world's largest manufacturer of solar PV panels and many of the electric vehicles. So the South-South cooperation also has those technology perspectives. The non-finance perspectives under the South-South cooperation is as important as the financial perspectives of South-South cooperation. This includes the technology and also the development experiences, how to balance the climate change with the economic development. And I do think China is in a well-positioned way of sharing those financial resources as well as the technology and know-how experiences with the other developing countries.
I know a lot of people are talking about how climate change is a crisis, but then in the eyes of some other people, it's also an opportunity for, say, new technology or what we call green development. And how do you think developing countries that maybe through cooperation or maybe through other financial or non-financial channels can make sure that they have a seat in the future table of, for example, new technology?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I do think to make sure developing countries will have a seat in the technology and also the other climate discussions, this is where the role of multilateral venues, including UNFCCC, is so important. UNFCCC, as well as many other multilateral venues, are the places where developing countries can have a role, arguably equally as developed countries. So we have to rely on multilateral venues to ensure that we can have the place to elevate the voices from developing countries, and particularly the most vulnerable countries as a result of climate crisis that we're facing every day. So that is a very important piece. In terms of the technology part, what we have seen is there are a lot of bilateral collaboration we have seen on technology. Some examples also we have seen is the Chinese investors on solar manufacturing capacity. And many of them are looking at Southeast Asia market as a promising market for them to move the manufacturing capacity from mainland China to Southeast Asia. And I will argue many of them are market driven or the commercial interest oriented investment. And it's not necessarily about government to government. It is driven by how promising the market is. The Chinese investors are having many of them joint ventures with the local investors in Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam to start pretty large scale solar manufacturing capacity, for instance, in Southeast Asia. So I do think several of the enabling conditions we have seen in those Southeast Asia countries include very promising market access to international investors, including those from China, and also more stable policies and enabling conditions set up by the national and the other levels of governments in those countries. So to your question of what could ensure the developing countries will have a seat at those table, I do think beyond unilateral C, the policy conditions, regulatory frameworks, the enabling conditions to attract international investment are the essential elements we're looking at for developing countries to unlock the significant technology transfer and the financial flows to benefit the economic growth as well as the climate agenda in developing countries.
Since you mentioned about multilateralism and how it is very important to ensure and help developing countries, then at the same time, at this COP especially, I've heard a lot of people complaining how, for example, framework under the UN is very inefficient and they can spend days and weeks negotiating, and even with the deal that we see in Baku it's delayed over 30 hours and still met with a lot of objections from many developing countries. So how do you view the current negotiations undertaken under the UN framework? Do you think we need a reform, or is the best that we can get at the current times?
Yeah, I definitely feel, and I heard a lot of frustration, disappointment in Baku during the last 2 weeks. And this is real because of how long that can take us to get to the final deal of Baku. However, I don't really recall the framing in English, but it's like you don't throw the bathing water away from the child. It's just because quite inefficient. And people in Baku and watching the process very closely, not from Baku, do share similar level of disappointment because at the end it was rushing to have the final deal agreed. And some of the countries still express their disagreement on certain levels of the final deal. But however, UNFCCC is arguably the only place that each country have an equal vote to the final decision out of the multilateral decision process. And to have a deal that will benefit developing countries on their climate transition, it is essential to show the solidarity at UNFCCC. It's also where we can see transparency can be achieved. And also under the design of UNFCCC, we're not only talking about finance, we're also talking about the ambition for mitigation and adaptation. So looking at the whole package of the climate action with what kind of support that's needed, there's still a role for UNFCCC to play. I don't think that we could afford to walk away from UNFCCC at this point and not in the near future.
as you mentioned about the case in Southeast Asia, that a lot of the efforts taken by the private sector has been valued. So when it comes to achieving the final finance goals, how do you think we can continue to mobilize even more of private sector?
Yes, in terms of the final finance goals we're talking about, in Baku, it's also written as the 1.3 trillion every year that's needed. This is a different one from, in terms of the narrower scope, that's the 300 billion every year from developed country to developing country. Between the 1.3 trillion and 300 billion, the private finance will have to play such an essential role in bringing us close to the climate finance that's needed. There are several sectors, for instance, the renewable energy generation sector. For many developing countries, it will make more sense for private finance instead of more valuable public finance or highly concessional finance to support the energy or power generation sector, which is compared to many other sectors, are more close to attract private finance as a commercial and business deals. And I'm making a reference to the adaptation finance, for instance, where the private finance at this point, and I think in the near future, will not have the appetite to invest in compared with the power generation sector. So I think one essential question to answer, well, firstly, to recognize is that we do need private finance as well as public finance to achieve the whole package of the climate finance deal that we need. And recognizing the role of private finance, the answer is what are coherent methods that we will want the public finance and private finance to play jointly in closing the gap on climate finance. We have seen in the past, unfortunately, that in some areas, the public finance is kind of competing with private finance. There are many incentives to understand how the public finance is also looking at larger ticket size when they are looking at similar investment of private finance. So how to really position the public finance as not to crowd out of the private finance, but truly enable and make more projects bankable to be considered by private finance. That's probably the reform where we need. And this is not just for the multilateral development banks. This is also for many of the development and financial institutions, including the national development banks in many developing countries. Is if they can recognize their goal is to mobilize private finance as much as to spend out their own capital and finance, that'll be a big change where we can see to unlock a lot more private finance into the sectors on climate finance.
Later into the next COP in Brazil, COP30 that will be, do you think some positive outcomes can come out from that COP? Do you still have your hopes high at this point?
I don't think I have my hopes high. I do think that we couldn't afford stopping at where we have got on Baku. We were talking about a more robust climate finance package that's needed. Again, we're not only looking at the quantum target, we have to look at the transparency. We have to look at the accountability. We have to look at what that means for a better quality of climate finance. We also have to look at, to some extent, adaptation finance. What's the scope of the climate finance channeled and targeted adaptation finance? And also many developing countries, particularly the least developed countries and vulnerable countries are looking at what will be the minimum climate finance that's needed for those who are most vulnerable to climate change. So all those key elements of a robust climate finance deal will have to be spelled out in Brazil. And we have seen the Brazil presidency is stepping up in a very proactive way during Baku. And that's where I will stay very hopeful of a stronger presidency in Brazil and what they can deliver, not just to climate finance deal, but also to the other climate deals that we expect at COP30.
Will finance continue to be the core issue at COP30?
I will say yes. And if we're looking at the Baku deal, the COP COP29 presidency clearly said there's a Baku to Berlin roadmap to 1.3 trillion. That's where the agenda is basically set between now and the Brazil COP30, what will be needed under this roadmap to achieve the 1.3 trillion climate finance goal. But also to point out, I don't think that UNFCCC is the only venue to address how we will be closing the gap on 1.3 trillion. There are certain questions that's probably out of the scope of UNFCCC. For instance, there has been some cross-reference to the MDB reform. How can we ensure that MDB can channel more financing into developing countries? There are other venues out of UNFCCC, including G20, where this is an ongoing discussion that we will need to look into. There's also the discussion of, for instance, how to remove the fossil fuel subsidy or the other harmful subsidies on biodiversity and others. There are, again, the other multilateral venues where that's more proper to bring this discussion and building upon the existing discussions outside of UNFCCC to address how this practical roadmap should look like. So I think for the next steps, we will be looking at not just the COP30 in Brazil, but many other venues, multilateral and bilateral, to see how we can mobilize as much as we can and across the different financing mechanisms, how we can close the gap on the 1.3 trillion US dollar every year.
Liu Shuang and her team analyzed China's contributions to international climate finance and found something quite interesting. Between 2013 and 2022, China voluntarily contributed an average of 4.5 billion US dollars a year through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative and South-South Cooperation. Another report by the Center of Global Development also had a similar finding. Their analysis put the number at 4 billion US dollars a year from China to other developing countries. The reason I want to bring up these studies is that it's important to recognize China's role in climate finance. It could pave the way for more ambitious financial pledges from developed nations. So I want to end this episode with a quote from Liu Shuang's report. Acknowledging that China is already a significant voluntary contributor to climate finance could make developed countries more comfortable increasing their own contributions and ultimately facilitate negotiations for larger collective commitments. A big thank you to Liu Shuang from the World Resources Institute for sharing her insights, and thank you for listening. If you have any questions about climate change, feel free to reach out to me at fei.fei@cgtn.com, fei.fei@cgtn.com. I'd be happy to help you find the answers. And don't forget to subscribe to Climate Watch for more updates on what's happening to our planet and what we can do to make a difference. Also, I've launched my own newsletter called Rivers and Mountains. If you want to receive a weekly updates on climate actions here in China and elsewhere in the world, feel free to connect with me on Substack. Until next time, take care and stay curious.